Good evening, folks.
Good evening.
I'm Kit Cassingham, and this is Speaker's Corner. It's so good to see you all here. Dr. Kathryn Jacobs earned her PhD in literature from Harvard University and then proceeded to teach various college classes from New Jersey to Texas. She did that for 34 years. She has written 6 books of poetry, published about 250 poems in about 45 different journals, and she has 14 scholarly articles floated around out in the universe. Tonight is a twist on what she's done professionally and what she has presented before. Kathryn introduced us to this topic in her May talk, A Life Lived Differently, or the Poetry of Autism. Tonight she's going to educate us about autism from the inside. Miss Kathryn, come on up.
Let's see. Yes, it's working. Okay, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I'm going to focus on autism from the inside, how it feels like to be in the head of somebody with autism. The first thing you'll probably notice is that this picture, which I took off the internet at a Cleveland clinic, I think, is not from the inside. This is exactly the kind of thing you would get if somebody outside is diagnosing. And probably a number of you have at least one of these qualities, even though you are statistically probably not autistic. And that is one of the things I want to start with. You can't do a blood test for autism. You can't, at the moment, do a brain. Sorry, I'm supposed to sit still. You can't do a brain scan or anything at the moment for autism, although that might someday be possible. Autism is a collection of symptoms, I guess you could say, and different doctors have different priorities and weights and even somewhat different symptoms. For instance, you've seen this one. I was thinking of asking for hands, but it's going to be too dark for me to see hands, so don't bother. But just think about how many of you at least know people who are probably not autistic but share some of these qualities. And then this is another one, a little bit more elaborate, I guess, with the clinical features, but you'll notice that in the middle they have repetitive behaviors. That one was not on this one. All right, and I'm just illustrating some of the differences, the different weights and the different people can give you, will diagnose it differently. The repetitive behaviors is often called stimming, which is self-stimulating, can be anything, could be pacing, can be jumping up and down, it could be waving your hands like this in the air. I mean, it could be all kinds of stuff. And if you put it that way, that sounds negative. Except that if you're, say, teaching and you pace around in the classroom and are sort of dramatic, then the students will say that you are incredibly energetic and they will love it, all right? One of my points is that some of these qualities, we talk about them as if they're negative, and some of them are negative, are disadvantageous at least, but a lot of these things can be very positive depending on the context you have. And this is just by way of sort of giving a general definition of autism, which is not easily done, okay? Because it is a conglomerate of characteristics. All right, so there's that. And then I wanted to start with, I was going to do myths, plural, but I've really focused on one here. One that sort of annoys me is that they say autists can't empathize. That's something that a lot of people will tell you, and I have several objections to it, as you can see. The first one is simply logical. Autists, are different people, like everybody else's are different, and when you've met an autist, you've met one. But in addition, it is frequently many autists have difficulty reading faces, so they don't know what you're communicating, all right? And that makes for a disconnect very early in life, and that can lead to frustration, and that can lead to withdrawal. I'm going to, in the course of this lecture, I'm going to give you little slides that are sort of from the outside, how the professionals would define it, and then I'm going to give you Dan, and I've chosen poems that, from his point of view, all these poems are from Dan's point of view. Dan is one of my alter egos, okay? He's a conglomerate of, people I knew, someone in my family, parts of me. So I'll give you Dan, and that's how Dan's reaction, so you can sort of see how he feels and thinks when he's dealing with this particular problem. And one of the things you'll find is that just because somebody can't read faces very well, it doesn't mean they can't empathize. And here I'm going to use the most famous autist, I think as far as I know, she is the most famous autist, Temple Grandin, as an example. She was a professor at Colorado State. She was a professor of animal husbandry, and she much preferred the animals to people. She was quite frank about that, by the way. She liked the animals. She had a lot of difficulty dealing with people, and it didn't stop her from being quite a successful person. And she's written a lot, and some of the things she writes are in her field, and I haven't read any of those. And some of the things she writes are about how she's dealt with her autism, and she's actually given interviews with reporters and people at different times. I read an article once by a reporter who went to her office and chatted with her. And she tells various stories. So one of the things that Temple Grandin dealt with was face blindness, and that's an inconvenience, all right? When she was at the office, if she met somebody who came into her office, or she met them in the hallway, or in the academic setting, if it was somebody she worked with, she always knew who they were. And she basically explained that it's like a multiple choice question with more choices, than the average 4 or 5 you see in a multiple choice. That, between basically gender and height and coloring and different things like that, she could always know who she worked with if she saw them. But if she saw them in the grocery store or in the post office or someplace else, she said most of the time she wouldn't recognize them. All right. For her, it was the context. There are just too many choices, too many possibilities, too many strangers in one of the other contexts. And so she dealt with that simply by telling. She was very frank about her autism, and she says, I see you someplace else, tell me who you are, right? Tell me your name. So she did the same thing with her students, by the way. She would come in the beginning of her class, and she would tell them that she was autistic and that she had some face issues. And if they have a question, they're absolutely encouraged to come and talk to her. Just tell her their name and their class, so that she would know she could place them. All right. So she's written so much about how she dealt with things. But that was one of the things I wanted to mention. And then, just by a little human interest, there's another one that very much interested me that the reporter wrote about in the article I read. Temple Grandin was, as she said, everybody, people like animals need companionship, and they need touching and contact. But she had problems with her relationships with people. She tended to keep them sort of limited, and so she didn't have a lot of that. And she started, because she was a smart woman, she started thinking about the problem of how do I handle this, and she came up with this design, which she actually had made for her. It was a soft chair, and around the chair were basically these arms with cushions on the inside, and she would push a button, and the cushioned machine thing would embrace her. All right, and then she would say she got great consolation. I mean, it felt good being embraced in this nice cushiony embrace, and yet she didn't have to deal with the complications of people. All right. So anyway, she's if you're gonna, most people who are officially diagnosed with autism are people who are struggling with something, people who often, that's done in childhood, so it'd be people whose parents are worried about them, understandably, but that biases our idea of it. All right, we think of autists as people with all kinds of non-functional problems, and in fact there's a whole spectrum, right, of people, and if you are, dealing with the world, reasonably well, you just don't get diagnosed, is what it comes down to, or very rarely are you going to get diagnosed. Okay, so that sort of tackles what it is, and at least one of the myths that annoys me, a couple of myths really, the idea that you're somehow, doomed. And for that, I'm going to go on to this one. I'm going to start now reading from Dan's point of view. We've established, I've been talking about face blindness because Dan has problems with face blindness. He has some of the other issues you'll hear about. And this picture I took from the web. I've seen it many times. And I like it because it gives you the point of view of the autist. You'll notice that they're happy, sad, and angry are pretty much the same picture. To me, they are the same picture, at least. And that's because the autist can't read the face, all right? They're not seeing the distinctions. And then that one, trying to be normal, well, that's just, ouch. That's the frustration, all right, of it. Okay, so this is Dan dealing with these problems. Don't smile so much. Dan's way too busy for a slimy soup of feelings. Dan has jobs. He needs to focus on his backpack now and tying shoes or turning at the rail because his feet don't know the way to school. Last time their faces baffled him, the feet decided to go shopping. So, no smiles, which means no unsmiles either, because they say so many tangled, complicated things. His shoes get tied together and he's late, which is a thing that Dan despises. And it's worst of all the way eyes stick to him instead of bouncing off politely. So Dan doesn't look at people. He prefers his Batman backpack because it won't change and doesn't need explaining. And this, among other things, is an example of Dan trying to simplify his choices, trying to focus on what he actually needs to focus on, and the problems of all the people trying to communicate things which he's not getting. All right. And this is another one about the really, fundamentally, what these are not just about the faces, these are about the disconnect with other people, of walls and windows. Dan used to bang his head against the wall, because the wall, at least, did not pretend it wasn't there. It wasn't in your way, refusing to be understandable. In some ways, Dan would like to be a wall, because a wall is so predictable. If you want out, you look for tunnels, or, on lucky days, a door. It's people who are sometimes see-through, but you bump them, or they stand there smudged like windows. Smudges mean pretend doors that the cardinals can't see. Dan saw one break himself. And honestly, Dan used to be a stupid cardinal who banged himself on people, but he learned. So nowadays, when the smudges frustrate him, he settles for a wall. And there is, by the way, another example of Dan identifying with the cardinal, all right, who's hitting himself, the way they do on windows or mirrors, rather than identifying with the other people whom he's having trouble communicating with. All right, so disconnect leads to frustration and leads to withdrawal. And then this poem, these poems come out of a collection, and here I should probably say that Dan has a mother and a father, but the father and the mother are having marital problems. It doesn't help marriages to have a disabled child, basically. And the father is more or less a little disappointed in Dan. Dan is not what he expected. He thinks that if Dan just tried harder, he could somehow be more like he expected a son to be. And his mother defends him, of course, and so that causes problem. Josh is a younger brother, and he is a neurotypical younger brother. All right. If Dad would just stop yelling. The Dan is sorry now for lightning rods, though he knew nothing of them yesterday. Their job is to be zapped. Dan wants to say that if a scary person put him there, he'd lie down flat, and the poor rods should stay inside with Josh and Mother. But the clouds need somebody to yell at, so the rods are stuck there, helpless. Dan is not allowed to run from yelling either, so he stares and waits for it to stop, respectfully. Show some respect, he tells Dan, angrily. The Dan is silent, but his thoughts are loud. He feels exactly like a lightning rod, and even Mom can't help him. All right, so you can see none of this is particularly helpful for human relations. This one is Dan's out of here. I don't suppose it matters very much, but a few of you probably know a children's book. It's called Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. All right. In that book, all right, that's not Dan, that's Alexander. When Alexander is very upset with everything going wrong in his day, he always wants to go to Australia. All right, and he figures that he can, things will be magically better in Australia. Dan sympathizes, I think, but for Dan it's Arizona rather than Australia, because Dan probably has never been to Australia, but Dan had a vacation with his family, excuse me, in Arizona, and as you can see, he liked it. Just give me a sec. Okay, this is also Dan empathizing with other things again besides people. It's easier to sympathize with trees than human beings. Dan is human, but he isn't always sure he likes himself, and he's the one who lives behind the face that mugs at him in mirrors. But the trees are much more stuck than Dan is. He can grow and move to Arizona. Seeds get dropped on rocks or lawn mowed, or their ponds dry up, and they can't fix it when they're older. They adapt. That's what his dad says. And Dad says that people grow around the rocks like trees, and Dan should too, but he refuses. Dan is tough and prickly, like the Choya are. He's off to Arizona. There's a whole lot I could say about the role that Australia plays in literature, but it's not relevant to this lecture, so I'm going to drop that. All right. Okay. Dan is definitely a butterfly, more identification with non-humans, which Temple Grandin talks a lot about too. The butterflies need coats now. See-through wings belong to summer. Dan is worried. Soon it will be way too cold for butterflies. If they were only sensible like birds. But Dan's been watching, and he's never seen a double string of butterflies V south. Maybe they wait till evenings and sneak out. But butterflies get lost so easily, they'd probably forget and zigzag north, or they become a cloud of butterflies and get distracted. They can't organize. A butterfly is an explorer, but it takes a bird to make an army, and Dan's noticed that the armies mostly win. So there may be no butterflies come spring. Which is, for me, a little poignant moment for Dan. Okay, I'm going to proceed on at this point. You'll see here some of the secondary issues that appear. They can appear in non-autists, obviously, but they appear more often among autists than they appear in, average random people. and they cause problems of their own. The last lecture I gave, that was when I was talking about autism, I dealt with what Dan thinks of as the gray voice, gray as pencils. If you're having a great deal of difficulty verbalizing, if you have to focus really, really hard just to talk, all right, then it is easy to talk like this. You know, there's this flat with gaps voice because the person is really focusing hard on trying to what they're saying. So I had a poem, I think, about that one. I'm not going to give that one again. I'm going to deal with another one which is very common, which in my family is called the fist of doom. It's if you have poor hand control, there's a desire to hold like this fist here is holding tight, like you're going to stab somebody, basically. And that's not a good position for writing, handwriting, which is fortunately much less important than it used to be when I was young. But Dan has well-meaning people who are trying to teach him to use pen and pencil, and he is struggling with it. And I thought it would be helpful to look at it from Dan's point of view. Dan's not allowed to use the fist of doom for pens, but when he holds it tight that way, the pen feels safer. If you give it room, it wiggles anxiously and disobeys. It wants a hug. So Dan makes a cocoon out of his fingers, but that's not allowed. They pry his fingers open, showing him. So now the pen feels naked. Dan sits bowed and waits until their shadows go away, and then he fists it, warm, safe, happy pen, and makes his letters large and wobbly, loud as Dan would like to be. No, none of them stay in the line. The pen refuses, and they feel a lot like Dan. Dan is getting, among other things, angry. All right. Executive function disorder is, none of these things are something you'll see in all autists, but executive function disorder is one of the most difficult features really to work with, because if you look at this list, it affects almost everything you do. Like if you're going to get dressed, all right, you don't think of it as having very many steps, but if you're going to put pajamas on, the first thing you've got to do, and this comes up in the poem I'm going to get to in a minute, the first thing you've got to do is take off whatever you were wearing first, all right? If you don't remember the right order, getting the pajamas on isn't going to work very well, all right? I mean, there's basic working memory, switching between concepts. Inhibitory control is more about ignoring distractions, background noises, annoying sounds, alarms, things like that. Blow dryers. There's a blow dryer that makes a really loud noise in a bathroom, can be very upsetting. There was something I was intending to tell you. I was reading recently another article, and they were doing a study. They took a lot of people, children for the most part, but not completely, who had been diagnosed as autistic, and they did brain scans, and then they took normal people and they did the same brain scans on the normal people. Normal, neuronormal, I guess, is what people call them. For most of you, if you suddenly hear a loud, annoying noise, all right, there's part of your brain that lights up, basically. And if it stays on, all right, it doesn't get better, it doesn't go away, it just stays on, while they watch, that part of your brain that lights up dims down again. Like, you still hear it, you probably still don't like it, all right, but you're able to put it in the background, tune it out partly, deal with it in some way, all right? When the autistic people were having their brain scans, that part of the brain stayed lit. It didn't dim down until the noise went away, and then it dimmed down. All right, so they're reacting to the noise exactly the way you did for the first second. All right, but they're not able to tune it out. So that's I thought that was something I only found out a few weeks ago. I thought that was very interesting. And I don't need to read all this to you, except to say that if you look online, I'm very dubious about this, frankly. If you look online, you'll get numbers like 64 to 80% of autists have some degree of executive function disorder. I think that has a lot to do with who gets diagnosed with having autism rather than the total number. But you have it's a difficult thing to deal with sometimes, and hence Dan is working on these things, mind you. You can work on these things. She missed a step, Dan thinks. Let me also say that Dan's mother has a younger child, and she's got her husband that she's not getting along with real well, and sometimes, like all people, she gets distracted. So right now, she's telling Dan what to do, and then she's, going off and coming back and checking on him, basically. She missed the step, Dan thinks. He put them on exactly like she told him, and that works, as long as Dan is naked. She may like his dinosaur pajamas, so does Dan, but they get stuck on street pants, and what's worse, he had no feet left, so the words were gone, and it got very noisy. Naked first. Then she said toothbrush and escaped again, which meant Dan had to climb to reach it, and there was a lot of blue paste, but it worked. So then he brushed Tyrannosauri too, because their mouths are always open. You can see that. She should have told him he was organized when she came back, because she likes that word, and Dan deserved it. But she only found the train pajamas and began again. It was a very tiring bedtime. All right, and of course, when you're tired, you can work on something, but when you're tired, that's when you slip back, so it was a difficult evening. Okay, this is Dan's description of how it feels when he's having problems with executive function. Dan's head is like a picture postcard brain he has to keep arranging. Lots of times, the card he fingers doesn't fit the one unraveling around him. Then he has to match it quickly, without panicking, because he needs a postcard to behave. The edges have to run together so that Dan can make a map. But some of them are stuck in boxes like a picture frame, and that makes gaps which Dan despises, since it means he has to guess. And yesterday fell in the white space, so Dan flailed about without a map, without directions, or perhaps he just mixed up the postcards, but it all went wrong from start to finish till Dan squeezed his eyes tight shut like two closed doors. Complete withdrawal. I can't deal with the world anymore. And this is the last of the poems in this category. Dan gives up, and this is just a picture I found that reminds me of how he feels. It was a hard day. Dan has failed and failed. It felt like floors collapsing under him, which floors don't do. But if they're planning to, you need to know. And people are like floors. Dan has to think that they're reliable, or he's afraid to move. It used to be that both his parents were predictable, but father left, and first he yelled things, so Dan clearly didn't understand the rules that make up fathers. And now Miss Lopez is not his teacher. Nobody says why. Forget her, Dan, start over. Yes, he's mad. It's one thing to learn silly people rules when it's like reading. Alphabets don't change, but faces do. Too bad, Dan. Just exchange one person for another, home or school. The faces flip like cards. Dan is afraid of waking up tomorrow. I believe that Miss Lopez either, I don't know whether she had health problems or got pregnant, but anyway, because of medical things can't be talked about, nobody told any of the kids what was going on. She was just another person that he just sort of gotten to read who disappeared on him. Trying to think if there's something I'm supposed to tell you about that poem. Well, it's probably sort of self-evident. Okay. This is something I touched on in the beginning of this lecture. Autism is not always a problem. We tend to define autism as a problem because when it isn't, no one complains. In this respect, you might compare it to depression. And I read a really interesting article about this some time ago now by a doctor who worked with depression. Doctors study depression because people who suffer need help. And roughly half of all depression has no environmental cause. That is, you're not grieving the loss of somebody or something like that. All right. No one complains about unreasonable happiness, though. All right. So it goes unstudied. And the doctor was saying that there's no data on it because no one studies it. But he was guessing that just as there can be chemical causes of depression, that there are people who are simply happier than their life has any reason to make them feel. But they have lucky chemicals, so they're happier anyway. Cheerful disposition. I think that was sort of a cool thought. So in the same way, lots of highly functional people are, to put it delicately, on the spectrum. Such people are rarely, if ever, diagnosed, and yet many, I suspect most, families with diagnosed autists contain relatives who fit in just fine and yet have many of the same symptoms, maybe to different degrees, maybe different combinations. There's only so much that's known about it. But like I say, it's only a problem when it's a problem. All right, so an important point, I think. I want Dan to be somebody who is going to function, who is going to struggle and manage and function well in this world, but we'll see. Self-advocacy. When it is a problem, though, because you can't deny that it is sometimes a problem, self-advocacy is crucial. Dan is too young to be really good at self-advocacy, but he's learning. And then this is a quote from one of the sites I found about self-advocacy, and that leads to manifesto. I don't know how many of you know how when you're typing on a computer and you have the computer guesses what word you're trying to type and makes a suggestion on it. And Dan was typing, and when Dan types his name, Dan, the computer suggests dandelion, all right, which he found rather frustrating. In fact, for a while, Dan went around, he solved this problem by leaving out the A in Dan. He just made himself DN, because then the computer really didn't know what to do and didn't make any more irritating suggestions to him anymore. But of course, it's also about identity and advocacy, as you'll see. Dan types himself 3 letters. But the screen is positive that Dan is not a word. So it decides that what he really means is dandelion. Well, he doesn't. Dan is not a puffball. You can't scatter him and leave a naked-headed stemmy thing like legless Daddy Longlegs. And he's not a typo either, somebody's mistake you can go back and fix. Dan knows himself. So when he says he's meant to be like this, well, people should believe him, but they don't. They're just like the computer. On the screen, it's possible to backspace, so Dan does. But in the real world, Dan's just somebody who has to protest or he feels erased. And then I'm going to end with this poem. I wanted to end with that because, the story is not over, but Dan grows up. And, there's no magic in the world. Nobody waves a magic wand and just says, guess what, presto, you're not autistic anymore. He still is. Some things don't change. Some things are still frustrating, but he's a bright kid, and he works hard and works around things and can have a satisfactory life, all right, being Dan. So this is written by Dan 20 years later as an adult. Dan's voice is still as gray as pencils, and each time he hears himself, it frustrates him. And he still worries about butterflies because they wander without fitting in, and having tried it, he's quite certain now that zigzagging is not the way to win. So you might think not much has changed, except he's figured out how people look at him. That's what adult means, mostly. So convinced that all he had to do to reconcile the puzzle of their disconnect with him was find the missing key, and all the while there wasn't one, except to analyze each separate, not quite smile. Dan does have friends, however, and last year Josh flew with him to visit the saguaro, though he swears he likes to make Dan laugh. The plant life here is just as keen to bite him. And there's an earlier poem, I might have read it last time in May, that where when they visit Arizona, of course he wants to pat one of those teddy bear choya. Most of you have probably seen them. It's a really, really bad idea. You don't want to do that. And now, of course, it's a memory. So they're both adults and they both know better than to go around petting choya. But it's something that they remember together, from childhood. And so I would like to leave them, Dan and Josh, camping together in Arizona, friends, brothers close to each other in adulthood too. And the fact that one of them is autistic and the other one isn't doesn't change any of that. I think that's my attempt at sort of mixing realism with a certain degree of optimism that I think can be warranted. I think that is all I have to give you. And now, if there are any questions? Oh, you all got much brighter.
You've illuminated us.
Yeah, apparently so. That's right. That's good.
Questions, observations? I see a hand, so come up to one of the two microphones.
I've kind of forgotten,
I'm listening.
Kathryn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is Dan a made-up character, or is this someone you actually work with?
That is a very good question, and it's not an easy one to answer. Dan started off as somebody that I know, somebody in my family, but of course, poetry is verbal, and so I have to put things into words that aren't always, that Dan at that age, particularly when he was very young, would not have put into words. So I became the filter, I became the interpreter, all right? And then I started noticing how much I have in common with Dan. For instance, stimming, and that's a perfect example. If you're, like I say, if you're in a classroom and you're wandering up and down and you're giving dramatic readings, and sometimes, like, if I had two Shakespeare characters that were talking to each other, I would jump, over to one side and give that one, and then I'd jump over there. So if you're pretty antsy, students love it, all right? They think it's great, all right? It's not stimming anymore. It's a positive, all right? So I started noticing how many things that I have in common with Dan, and that changed my interpretation of Dan. So at the moment, I think Dan is an amalgam. He is partly somebody I know, and he is also at least as much me, if that makes sense. I'm identifying with how I think he would feel as a kid, and of course I'm probably wrong sometimes. I mean, people are. So I hope that is an answer. You want to?
Very interesting.
Okay, cool. All right. Anybody else? Yeah.
So how does autism get diagnosed?
What generally happens, all right, it's not the only thing that happens, all right, but what generally happens is that you have parents who are very concerned about a child and who's having difficulties of different sorts. And they go to their general doctor and the doctor says, well, he may not, he or she, they may not, they may guess that it's autism, or they may not, but they will refer the parents to a specialist, generally, and somebody who does work with autism and maybe some other things as well. And then they ask a whole lot of questions. I mean, it's a long process, a whole lot of questions of the parents. And if, depending on the age of the child and how responsive the child is, they'll ask all the questions they can of the child. You know, basically they gather a lot of info, all right? And in the case of the parents, it also involves filling out pages and pages and pages of multiple choice questions and things. You know, does he do this? Do they do that? That kind of thing. And then depending on how many of the boxes get checked, you know, that you know, like those first two slides I had. All right, depending on how many of those, okay, he has this autistic quality, he doesn't have that one, he has this, then they make a diagnosis. But it's only done by symptom, is my point. All right, there may be all kinds of biological, you know, things going on. I'm not arguing that there's not. Okay, not at all. I just mean that right now, that's the only way we have. It does tend to run in families. I mean, to different degrees. Somebody back there.
I don't need a microphone.
Yes.
Fran, yeah, okay.
Of 30 plus years teaching elementary school or whatever you call it, it would be, it's often the teacher who makes the suggestion to the parents.
Yes, yes.
The parents might be concentrating on disorganisation or obsession about being on time or an obsession about being late, and then the teacher might say, or after a couple of teachers have said, you know, he's not controlling it, they then go and seek attention. I don't know that a local GP, or what we call in Australia general practitioner,
Right, we call
who
that
sees a child for 15 minutes once a month, would be inclined to even think about something like that.
I bet anything you're right. I bet you're right. I certainly know some teachers who have told parents they are concerned and sent them to a psychologist to start with. So I'm positive that often happens. It could also, if the parents initiated it, it's usually before school, like at a very, very young age. But what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and I don't think a GP would diagnose. A GP would, but often that's somebody that they'll go to first, and then they get a reference, basically. But yeah, I'm sure you're right, Fran. Yes?
Vocabulary is very important to you.
Yeah.
In this whole explanation of things is something that I might say it's akin to political correctness. I'm not sure if you can say something wrong.
I don't think of it as political at all. Not on. I mean, to me, this is just not political. It's just dealing with something that I have some experience dealing with.
I'm behind Kit over here on your left.
Okay.
We often hear about Asperger's being
Yeah.
a mild form.
Yeah.
Is it really the same and just milder, or are we talking two different things?
I think the word Asperger's, this is my thinking, okay? This is not like I'm telling you the truth from on high. I think it's what we call people it's what some people call people when they don't want to be labeled as autistic and they're functioning. I mean, they're dealing just fine in the world, all right? So we make up that name. I remember that most people who are diagnosed in childhood, at least, and that's most people, they get diagnosed before adulthood, they're diagnosed because they are struggling. And then people who are in fact functioning don't like to be seen as struggling. So, in other words, I think it's just a word we use for people who are on the spectrum, but are not, but are managing, or maybe even very successful. You know, I mean, look at Temple Grandin, okay? I mean, she was a professor for most of her life, and she had no trouble teaching, and she had no trouble with her colleagues. I mean, she was different, but...
And people like Bill Gates are often called Asperger because he stims. I mean, you watch him; he's
Oh,
rocking
yeah.
all the time.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, you've seen me. I stim all the time. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's a guess. I mean, that's how I look at it. Anyway. There's somebody over there.
Can you come down?
Yeah. poor Chris.
How can neurotypical people help the autists in our life?
Oh boy. That's a complicated question, and it's probably one that a lot of people in the audience could answer as well as I could. I think you partly have to see what helps one particular. I mean, that it's such an individual matter. You know, what works, what helps. Often simplifying, like the loud noises are just going to be a bit like a lot of are going to be a problem. And even in a classroom, an autistic child is much more likely to be driven crazy by all the whispering, that goes around in a classroom. Like, these people are supposed to pay attention, but kids are what they are. All the murmuring, they can't block it out. They can't filter it. I mean, they hear it all the time, okay? And it drives them crazy, and it's very distracting. All right, so what people will often do is let the autistic child go to a quiet room. Like the teacher gives them the assignment or teaches them, and then the kid is sent to a quiet room, and that they're able to function, to handle things better that way. Fran, you might have some answers on that one since you were teaching. If you can give her the mic, I think she wants to.
Clicking a pen.
What about my pen?
No, clicking a pen. The
Oh, yeah.
click sound?
Yeah,
Some teachers have to ban that in their room.
yeah.
Ban those sort of pens.
Yes. If a child is also allowed to move, like I'll tell you, since I already admitted that I like stimming. All right. Remember that I was a teacher, and so I would have to go to department meetings and committee meetings of all kinds, and some of them dragged on and on and on, and you have to sit and be very decorous. All right. And I studied, and I'm not good at being decorous, so I studied all the motions that are socially acceptable to make in committee meetings. So, for instance, you can lean back like you're really thoughtful about what somebody's saying, okay? And then, I honestly, I worked all this out. Then you can lean forward like, oh, I never thought of that before, okay? You can also rub your hands together, because people think you're cold, but they don't, it's okay to be cold, all right? So I've got all these motions I've got down, and then if it really comes to it, the meeting is just not there, and it keeps going, and I'm being driven crazy, then you ask for a bathroom break, okay? And then, if you don't need to use the bathroom, I would go to my office and shut the door and, just jump up and down for a couple of minutes, and then I'd come back and sit perfectly quietly.
Catherine, I have to tell you,
Yeah?
we all do that.
Good. Well, like I say, I mean,
Normal.
there's very few of the things on those first two slides that people who are neuronormal don't do. It's not like there's any, like they're doing, these people are doing something that we don't do. It's just that they do more of it, all right, than we do. But I am glad to know that some of the rest of you went off and hit and...
We know what the movements are you can make in meetings and get away with it.
Yeah.
We know you
I am very relieved. That is wonderful. Yeah.
Catherine.
Yeah. Yes.
One more question.
Huh?
I really like the perspective that you've given. I've seen a lot of lectures on autism and read a lot about autism, but by bringing the poetry in, it kind of gives that sense of what's coming from within somebody that's dealing with autism. One thing I really gathered from a lot of the poetry was a high level of anxiety.
Yes.
Is that across the spectrum, or is that just certain people? Because I have known autistic people that really seem to have quite a peace within themselves, as long as they kept in a routine a lot of times,
right,
and things like that.
Good.
Is there a high level of anxiety?
Among the autists that I have worked with, there is a fair amount of anxiety. Now, that may get better. I mean, children have very little control over their lives, all right? And that may get better as somebody has more control of their life and has a pattern that makes them content, that they can live in. So I'm not at all arguing with what you're saying, but if you're like a square peg in a round hole, you know, that's anxiety making generally. It's partly just well, you know, the people who do not. We're almost back to the question of what can I do to help. Understanding is almost the first thing I would say that people can do to help. You know, even with things like the flat voice. You know, a little patience. It's like if you're listening to someone stutter. You know, rushing them isn't going to help. All right. Listening. You know, a certain amount of patience and kindness, even I think, would help a great deal. So I don't know whether remember that my doctorate's in medieval and Renaissance literature, okay, not autism. So I haven't done the kind of studies that would I could not tell you the percentage of autistic people that have this kind of anxiety, all right? The ones I have dealt with have a fair amount of anxiety, and that's something we've been trying to work on and help. But whether my people are typical or not, I wouldn't want to say. But it's a fair question. I just don't know if I can answer it. Yeah. Yes.
Right here.
Yeah.
Sort of two parts to the question.
Okay.
Is autism just being detected more often now, or is it increasing in society?
Right.
And the second part, are things like social media helpful or harmful to people that have autism?
Well, I guess I will work. Those are very hard questions. I guess I will try to tackle the second one first and say, insofar as it helps neuronormal people have some awareness to know what people are dealing with and to try to get help, all right? The quieter class, the smaller room, instead of the big classroom, for instance, that kind of thing. Insofar as the social media helps make that possible, helps it happen more often, that would be good. I'm not. I have certain things that I get annoyed by. All right, I get a little annoyed at everybody seeing it's always a problem. I mean, yes, it can be a pretty serious problem, honestly, but it isn't always a problem. You know, people are very adaptable. A lot of people, manage just fine. They find ways of dealing. That's the second question. The first question is whether it's being more diagnosed more. It is certain more people are getting the label, for sure, than used to. And the question of whether it happens more often, I don't know if I can really answer that question either. I can say that if you lived in a world of medieval peasants, all right, where like 90% of people are doing agriculture and they're not using fancy tools, all right, they're not using anything electric or anything you have to be trained really, anything dangerous of that sort. If you're going out in the field, then your parents teach you, all right, if you're male at least, your parents come out and they teach you how to use the hoe and they teach you how to do what you're doing. I would think that an autistic person in that society would be seen as different, but it doesn't mean the autistic person would be any worse in the field, So I don't know that it would matter as much in that society. I think it maybe matters more in our society, and that might be why there's more why we diagnose it more. But I'm not sure that percentage-wise whether it's changed or not. Is that an answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think.
Can you come forward?
There's two people here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Please go.
please come forward and help us with the mics.
Is autism strictly a behavioral characterization, or is there a body of medical work, autopsy, that points to changes in the brain structure for which it can be identified as a physiological change?
You're all asking really good questions. Remember that I'm not a medical doctor either, okay? The only brain, I was reading about this, and the only one I found that was clear and consistent was this thing in the response to the noises that I mentioned, that their brain, that if you are neuronormal and that annoying noise gets on, you may never like that annoying noise, but your brain, as you adjust, the alarm reaction, if you will, that lights up in that brain goes away, and it doesn't seem to for them. That suggests to me some kind of brain difference. But we don't have, and right now we can't scan brains until, I mean, if you give doctors a whole bunch of brain scans and you say identify which ones are autistic, and they can't do that, So that doesn't mean there isn't. I do not think of it as myself, if by you mean mere behavior, something that's easily changed. No, I don't think it is merely behavior. Some of the stuff is just too, you see it too early. I mean, you can diagnose, kids at the age of 2, with autism if they're dealing with a lot of things, and pretty confidently. And what happens after, shows the accuracy, if you will, of the diagnosis. So I don't think it is. It would, if it was just behavior, it would be easier in some ways for parents. All those parents who get frustrated would be trying to fix it, although Dan would say he doesn't want to be fixed. Dan would say that he is, all right, we have to finish to be done, but Dan would say that he's meant to be the way he is, and he doesn't want to be fixed. So, but a lot of parents would try, and it's not easy. I am told by Kit that we are running out of time, and so, Fran, I don't know what to do about it.
I just want to mention a book.
Yes?
Can I mention a book?
Yes, of course.
Make it fast.
Yeah?
It's called Rosie's Project.
So you have a recommendation for further study.
Kathryn, that is wonderful.
Thank you.